So good afternoon and welcome to the session Supporting Women and Children Returning from Violent Extremist Conflicts. Our moderator for today is Dr. Mary Bunn from the University of Illinois, Chicago. So I am sure this is going to be an outstanding panel, but I want to thank you all for providing this great information for us today. Mary?
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I didn't do one thing, Mary. Sorry.
Sure.
Got to do all my work. The QR code is working, so if you have a question, you want to send it through the QR code, and that is for the folks in the room and the folks online. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks again for joining us today for our panel presentation, which is going to focus on lessons learned thus far in terms of articulating best practices for women and children who are returning from contexts of violent extremism, some of whom are women and children in detention camps and in Syria, as you can see from the picture on the screen just now. Again, my name is Mary Bunn. I'm going to be functioning as the moderator / presenter today. And I want to begin by asking my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. And I'm going to begin with Dr. Stephen Wine, who will tell you a bit about himself, but also kind of the broader aims and goals of our project and what we'll be sharing with you today. Steve?
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everybody. I'm a psychiatrist and a professor at UIC in Chicago. I direct the Center for Global Health. I work in global mental health, and I work in this space of preventing violent extremism. And in this project, I've had the opportunity to work with great colleagues and some others in a project funded by DHS S&T that focuses on consolidating best practices based on scientific evidence for how to best support returning women and children, and then all the implications for other populations as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Steve. Heidi.
We work together closely, so easy to mix us up. I'm Heidi Ellis. I'm a clinical psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital. John?
Hello, everyone. John McCoy. I'm the executive director for the Organization for the Prevention of Violence. Very fortunate to be working on the project with Heidi, Steve, Mary, and others. And I oversee a psychosocial intervention program and research project that operates in Canada.
Yes, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our other colleague, Mike King, who's in the audience today. So just to give you a bit of an overview of our plan for today, our presentation today is really going to consolidate what we've learned over the last year of conducting this work. And so each of us is going to present very briefly about one major aspect of the project, share lessons learned or major deliverables thus far. And then we've planned to reserve a good portion of our time today to enable discussion with the audience about what we present today. So I'm going to begin by, let's see here. I'm going to begin by summarizing some of the major lessons that we learned from one aspect of our project, which had to do with synthesizing the available literature on so-called R&R programs, rehabilitation and reintegration programs for women and children exiting violent extremism. Very briefly, in total, we looked at 51 different documents from all major regions of the world. We found that the gray literature was much more developed in this area compared to the empirical literature. And in analyzing this body of work, we had four major foci in mind. First was where and with whom have these kinds of so-called R&R programs been implemented? What are the guiding definitions and theoretical frameworks that underpin this work? What is the program structure, including inputs and program activities for individuals, families at the school level, community, and at the macro level? And what are the outcomes that are identified for these programs or approaches to evaluating? So we'll very briefly summarize some of the key findings in each of those areas just to set the stage a bit for the state of the field right now and opportunities moving forward. In terms of guiding theories and definitions, we found that overall definitions, even basic definitions like reintegration, rehabilitation, were not well defined, and the literature overall was under-theorized. But of those theories that were identified, most commonly implicitly identified, the most common one was an international human rights framework. So that had to do with upholding the rights to safety and security of individuals. Next were programs that were informed by gender inclusive or gender empowering approaches, and those especially accounted for the needs of women in programs, both in program design and implementation. Equally were social integration and ideological approaches. So social integration approaches had to do with ensuring meaningful participation in cultural and social life, and ideological approaches were focused on traditional interpretations of Islam, authority of the state, and ideals of loyalty and obedience. There were several other principles, concepts, theories that were mentioned maybe one time across all the documents. In terms of program input, the literature really suggests that you need, not surprisingly, diverse, robust, multidisciplinary teams and stakeholders to implement R&R programs. And in total, we identified 40 different program activities that spanned individual, family, school, community, and macro levels. What you see here are the 5 most common program activities: mental health services, which most commonly targeted trauma, emotional distress, issues of self-esteem, and building resilience. Community social programs, these were group-based activities, often arts-based, nature, sports, and cultural events, considered especially important for youth and for facilitating peer connections and social inclusion. Next, promoting school and vocational enrollment. Those had to do with providing assistance to enroll in school, often for the first time for adult women, or re-engaging children and youth in school, often after a lapse in education. Health services, fairly self-explanatory, and then parent training and family education, which were home visits to assess family relationship, child development, provide parenting training, and so on. The sort of lack of clear outcomes was a real key gap in the literature, but we were able to identify 18 different outcomes that were mentioned at least once across program documents. Mental health, among those, mental health was the most common, which had to do with reducing symptoms, social and community integration, which was about reestablishing social ties and facilitating new social connections. Skills development, which was very broad and had to do with developing both personal, practical, and professional skills, economic self-sufficiency, and then finally self-esteem. So, what are the key takeaways from this systematic review of the literature? First, I think, is that the field is at an early and somewhat descriptive stage. What's perhaps most notable are 4 major gaps and opportunities for strengthening this program and practice area moving forward. Firstly, really clearly articulating definitions and robust conceptual frameworks to guide this practice area. Second is to clarify program inputs and activities. So as we said, we identified many diverse activities, but the question is, what are the key ones and for whom, especially adults versus children versus youth. Third is strengthening coordination and dialogue, particularly between security and non-security actors, which we see as a key area of investment moving forward. And then finally, the need to clearly articulate key outcomes for R&R programs and evaluation approaches. And each of my colleagues is going to pick up on one or more of these areas in their presentations. So now I'm going to hand it over to Heidi.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Mary really led a heroic effort in trying to make sense of what turned out to be a kind of disorganized body of knowledge. And when we actually took a step back and tried to understand what is out there, what we found was there really was a need to pull together some of the learning that had happened in the field in a more constructed, organized logic model, essentially, to try to make sense of not only what can we learn from what's been done, but what could we integrate from other fields that have maybe a deeper history of practice and evidence, and put together a bit more of a theory-driven logic model for how practices could work. So what I want to share with you now is that model. We, in fact, found that even what you call one of these programs was not entirely clear. So we variously saw different entities refer to it as repatriation and reintegration. Sometimes it was reintegration and rehabilitation. So what were the two R's that were for the foundation for R&R programs? And they didn't seem to capture all of the activities. So there was another R, resilience, that we found many of the strong programs were focused on. How can programs were working to build resilience psychological resilience among women and children so that they could overcome the adversities that they'd experienced and have some robustness to their trajectory of healing when new onsets of stress or trauma happened in their resettlement communities. So what I will speed to now, a logic model, of course, needs a long-term goal, and we put together this goal: a life of nonviolence with safety, well-being, opportunity, belonging, and dignity. And what you can see embedded in this is that we are really balancing both. There's a national security question, but there's also a human rights question. How do we help support these individuals? And we believe those really aren't separate questions, because individuals that feel fully supported, who can realize their dreams and goals, they're also going to be less likely to engage in violence. So here's our theory of change. Women and children returning from formerly ISIS-controlled territories have been exposed to trauma and adversity. They also face challenges upon returning to their countries of origin, including ruptured social networks, family conflict, community stigma, challenges of acculturation and resettlement stress, and identity conflicts with surrounding society. Unless these challenges are addressed, returning women and their children remain more vulnerable to retaining or reforming ties, or forming ties for children, with violent extremist networks as a means of fulfilling some or all of these needs. So we have 5 R's spread across 4 domains. First, there's repatriation and resettlement, and these are really in the most immediate needs upon returning or entering a country. Reintegration, which is the longer-term work of connecting with communities. Rehabilitation, and then finally, as I mentioned, resilience. As we started to put together what goes into these different domains, we were drawing not only from the existing programs that Mary mentioned, but also adjacent fields. So we found that refugee resettlement literature actually well describes activities that are needed during repatriation and resettlement. And doesn't describe all of the things that are needed, but there's quite a lot we can draw on from that field. And also from refugee resettlement, we can learn about reintegration, how you support integration into community. Criminal justice has quite a bit to say about rehabilitation, what works, what doesn't. And then finally, as I mentioned, psychological resilience has a broad literature and evidence base behind it. These are not necessarily meant to be chronological domains. Nothing happens in a linear fashion, particularly not when it's a complex situation like we're talking about, but there is a little bit of a cadence, a little bit of a dance where initially repatriation and resettlement goals are strongest, moving to reintegration. Rehabilitation, this is a really heterogeneous group of individuals coming back. Some may not have engaged in violence or may not even have held strict ideological beliefs. And so there's more thinking about how to help reintegrate into the community without some of those kind of sticking points. Others, there may be more rehabilitation that's needed, but across the board, thinking about civic engagement and how we support that. And then finally, resilience, which can start early, but often can also be sort of a continuation after some of the more basic needs are met. Repatriation and resettlement is really focused on physical, legal, and material safety. Do we have citizenship status for the individuals. Do they have a place to live? Do they have the health care they need for their most immediate needs? Reintegration then moves towards more economic, social, and civic integration. How do we think about helping families integrate in more meaningful long-term ways with community structures and entities and beliefs? Oftentimes, these activities are driven more by government entities and NGOs, especially repatriation and resettlement might be held, at a more top-down level. And this programming then can gradually, over time, shift towards some of the additional R's, like rehabilitation, where there might be a focus on critical thinking, religious dialogue, thinking around tolerance and diversity training, or political education. And then finally, resilience. Resilience is really made up of two different factors, psychological factors, such as hope and optimism, but also structural opportunities for growth and connection. These needs increasingly, I think, can be met by community structures. So thinking about positive youth development programs for youth, thinking about volunteer opportunities for women, so that they can begin to feel like they have some agency and contribution to make in their community. We put this all together in a grand logic model. What you can see here are the 4 domains on the left. Some thinking about what entities might be responsible or positioned to provide the supports needed under each of those domains. The types of components we just covered, moving from physical, legal, material safety down through to these more psychological and structural opportunities for growth and connection. And if we do these, then we believe this will feed into a range of outcomes. I'm going to turn to Steve in this minute to talk about outcomes, because he has done a much deeper dive into what those might be and how to measure them. And it's certainly one of the things Mary found in her work was that there's not great consistency of thinking around either what those outcomes are or measurement of them. But to move the field forward, to know if in fact this best practice model makes sense on the ground, we're going to need to move there. So Steve, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Heidi and Mary. Okay, let's start by listening to women who've returned. Here's what I've heard them say. I found myself. I found friends. It's hard in school when they say your child is a terrorist. We feel like we belong. And if you listen to practitioners who are working with them, they say things like, many of them have already forgotten. We try to connect them with folk traditions. Or they admit making a mistake and they resumed talking to their families. Oh, well, these women and practitioners are talking about a lot of things, but what I hear them talking about is in part outcomes. And what can we say about outcomes in this space? I think Mary said there's not much happening there in terms of measures. It's kind of sad, but everybody seems to want outcome measures, but so few seem to be investing in developing or implementing them. Well, we saw an opportunity to try to take one step in that direction, and we have, and I'm going to describe that to you a little bit. So the first thing we did is we did systematic reviews of the literature to look for any trace of outcome measures in all kinds of different literatures, such as Mary has alluded to. And the bottom line is that there were some indicators of what the constructs should be. Constructs like these women and practitioners alluded to, obviously in the mental health and education space, work and financial independence, physical health, social support, optimism, hope, things like that. No, I don't have slides yet. I also have one slide at the end. So when you kind of map that out, you also see that those different constructs correspond to different of the 5 R's that Heidi has talked about. Some cut across the 5 R's, like mental health cuts across every one, and some are more particular to one, such as rehabilitation. We also spent time talking with practitioners and with returnees, especially in Kazakhstan. We wanted their point of view on what we thought we should be asking people about in an outcome measure. So we kind of put all that together, and we came up with 18 different items, and I'll share those with you in a minute. And what we wanted to do is we thought it was important that whatever we put together embodied kind of 4 principles. And so one principle is that it be evidence-based, so that it was informed by what our review of the literature said should be outcomes of interest. We also thought it was important to be person-centered. That means like not a clinical tool that's asking about mental health symptoms. It's not a risk assessment tool asking about the person's likelihood to commit a violent act. It's more like how these women or children describe their lives and the progress they're making in the language that's and the perspective that comes to them naturally. The third principle is that it be ecological, and that it understands that this process of rehabilitation really depends on individual level, family level, community level, and macro level factors and processes. So we had to be asking about all those things. And the other principle was that it be collaborative. We wanted a tool that women, returnees, or children, and their practitioners would use together, and it would help to facilitate the process of R&R or 5 R's itself, and not disrupt that process. So we put together this tool. And here you can just see what it looks like. So the statements are statements like affirmative statements that a woman would make. So I have legal status as a citizen and all necessary papers. Or my basic needs are met, such as housing, food, finances, work, and school. And it goes on like that. I'll show you the next page. I like who I have become. I keep my children safe and well and help them grow. I'm managing my emotions in ways that do not lead to verbal or physical aggression towards others. I feel like I have a place in this country. So you can see that these questions are getting at different things like those women and practitioners said at the very beginning of my chat, and then also different kinds of constructs that Heidi has shared. So we asked the women to say whether you agree or disagree, and then we also asked them to rank what they think are the most important items. So far this has been implemented in 2 countries in Central Asia. It's been implemented in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan with several hundred people. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but what we're doing now is trying to establish psychometric properties, and I can tell you that so far it looks good. And then we're also using it to help to inform program development in those areas. So for example, it was very interesting where areas were relatively weak, meaning the women were feeling like their needs weren't fully addressed, and also areas where they felt were most important to them. These were definitely areas that the program should pivot in the direction of, and so now we have an evidence base for showing that. We haven't used those as tools for the women's own care and progress, but we think that it can be used that way, and we hope that local practitioners will adopt it in that sense. Actually, in the other country that we did this, it's probably going to be used more in that direction. So we think this has added something to the field. We think there's a long ways to go, but we're hopeful that this is moving us in the right direction. Of course, there are lots of other challenges. We want to adapt and implement this in other contexts. We actually plan to do it in the United States and Canada in more of a domestic violent extremism context. David from Yorktown is part of that collaboration, we hope. And we look forward to that. And I think that some of these 5R, the 5R framework in that manner will inform the work, but obviously it's not a one-to-one situation, right? It's going to have to be adopted. But I think that we think that that framework is still robust and will help us to set the right stage. And there are other challenges associated with this. People have said you can't trust what they say, and they're just going to put down there whatever they want you to believe. Well, I think that's true in so much of what we do in this space. But we think we can live with that and manage that and take a look at that and see if in fact that's a problem. I'll stop there. Thanks. Thanks,
Steve. I think, speaking of utilizing the tool in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, one of the features of the field is that we have few accounts of actual programs that have worked with women and children. Their priority may not be writing about their work or conducting a systematic review of their work, but in actually delivering services. So now I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to give a kind of real-life account of work with women and children who've returned and lessons they've learned thus far in implementing some of these principles.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mary. And I guess I kind of have a unique position here in working on the study and also being overseeing a program that is working with the small population of returning women and children that we have in Canada and seeing the ways in which the 5Rs can be detected in the work that we're doing. And I think what I'm trying to do here in this presentation is take some of the lessons from the front line, from the practitioners, from our social workers and our psychologists who are working with these individuals, and I think they illuminate a lot, actually, in an applied sense, some of the ideas that we were just talking about. So just really quickly by way of introduction, we're a not-for-profit organization based in Alberta, working in 3 broad lines of effort, but the one that I'm going to be talking about today is the psychosocial intervention program known as EVOLVE. That program was launched in 2019, so we're getting into the 3rd year of operations, and effectively here, the program operates as a multidisciplinary team, which, as was mentioned, I think is really essential for our success as a psychosocial intervention program in this space when we're talking about really complex populations, including individuals who are coming back from conflict zones, and the composition of this team. Effectively social workers who act as caseworkers, a forensic psychologist who helps us with things like risk assessment, but also mental health counseling, and mentors individuals who have cultural competencies. So we work with an imam who is working with this population, or individuals who are formerly involved with violent extremism. Very briefly, the practice framework, which obviously does integrate elements of the model that we're talking about. Relationships, I think, are key with this population. It's a naturally distrustful population. We need to build those relationships. We need to create a sense of safety for these individuals, like women when they come home, like children when they come home. And the trauma-based piece, of course, this is everywhere. What does this look like practically, I think, in our program? I think what our psychologists and our social workers are trying to do is to get the service participants to understand the way in which trauma impacts behavior. And I think that sort of education piece is the first essential element in generating change. And then finally, the resilience piece, the strengths-based piece. We want to encourage these hidden strengths that we're seeing in the service participants in a way that can help them to navigate the resources, the services that they need to succeed and to change in a lasting sense. Just really quickly, I have this slide up here. This is our cumulative caseload. It's dated. We didn't have time to update it before I got here. But effectively, on an off-topic note, it does illustrate what we're dealing with in Canada. IMVE, if you look at the blue up, is far right, xenophobic, misogynistic, anti-government, anti-authority. We're carrying a caseload around 50, mid-50s right now. But if you look at the bottom, and you see family members and participants related to RMVE, this is what the Government of Canada is using to refer to primarily Daesh, and this refers to religiously motivated violent extremism. And as you can see, the bulk here is family members. So these are immediate family members who have loved ones overseas in the camps in Rouge and Al Hol. And why are we prioritizing this area of work? Because I think it is essential. First, for repatriation, which frankly Canada has been, like many other countries in the global north, notoriously slow in facilitating repatriation. There's a handful of people who have come back. But also, how do we set the stage for those first essential stages in resettlement and reintegration? And how can the family act as a foundation or a base for that if they're present and they're supportive? So that's why we're really prioritizing this area of work, because we think it is so important to the outcomes in some of these R's that we're talking about. I'm going to skip these because we don't have time. And I'm going to get straight into a case study that we're working with. So this is a woman in her 30s. She's a single mom with a young school-age child. And she has been back in Canada for about a year. Based on various assessments that we've conducted through our psychologists. So this includes, full disclosure, we use TRAP 18 as our risk assessment. We've also conducted a psych assessment. This individual is low risk and moderate needs. In this particular case, we had contact previous to repatriation with the case study, with Jane. And we also had contact with the immediate family. We were working with the immediate family previous to her coming home. So what did this practically mean when she arrived? We had things in place. We had housing, furniture, childcare, food security. Everything was established and waiting for this individual in a way that was going to facilitate success during resettlement, which I think is a really important stage when we talk about connections to reintegration and rehabilitation. We need those foundations so someone feels secure and we can move into those other stages. But also, it builds trust. It builds early rapport. We had some contact with the individual previous to the return, and we were able to build trust with the immediate family, and that foundation, I think, was really important for us moving forward. So when Jane arrived, she met immediately with our caseworker, our senior social worker, Peter. Peter conducted a needs assessment, got an idea of what was going on, and we started to connect to additional services based on those needs, like a family resource center and a settlement agency, to help further that resettlement stage. But, and I think this is an important piece, almost immediately upon the return, she was speaking to her psychologist and she was beginning counseling. So rehabilitation was beginning pretty early in that resettlement stage. And what was the psychologist working on? I think you really need to think about the experience of individuals that are in these camps, right? They're living in a constant survival mode. That sense of safety and security has been lost for years. So how do you reestablish that in a way that's going to be commensurate with success in the space? So that is really what our psychologist has been working on in those initial phases. How do we create a sense of safety? How do we create a sense of optimism and a little bit of hope in the future, for the future? Another thing that we need to talk about, especially when we look at countries in the global north, are the inevitable legal challenges that these individuals are going to face upon return, right? And this is just a fact that law enforcement, security services, the judicial system is going to be involved. So developing that early cooperation with that sector for programs like ours is essential. And in this case, when this individual came back, they required a psych assessment and a risk assessment. And these were submitted to the court and helped to overcome some of those early hurdles. We're not there yet. But, you know, again, this is an important part Because if we want to get past the suspicion and the mistrust, getting past those legal hurdles are important. Moving into reintegration, we mentioned acculturation, not really an issue with Jane because she is Canadian born and raised, so there's no real cultural adaptation issues or a lack of familiarity that we've run into to date. And I do think this is something common that I'm hearing in our program and other programs, that there's sort of this initial period of hope and optimism and relief. I'm home, I have my child is safe, I am safe, and that period of relief quickly gives way to other realities. For example, Jane's a single mom. Mm-hmm. Jane's a single mom with debts that she incurred for repatriation. That's a challenge for anyone. Also, family tensions emerged quite quickly that we weren't aware of as someone who had been involved with the family. But fortunately, because we had that relationship, we built that early trust with the immediate family and with Jane, we were able to overcome that through some conflict resolution. And I think we're seeing things get back on track. So where we are right now with Jane is essentially we're trying to find ways that we can upgrade skills, education, find better quality employment, better pay, and help to create a better quality of life in that area. While of course, as was mentioned, that mental health piece, the post-traumatic recovery piece, that's ongoing. And unsurprisingly, what has our psychologist found? That there was a lot of trauma previous to involvement in that family and for this individual. And I think we're going to see this repeatedly because we're going to find that that was a driver of involvement in the first place. So I'll leave it there. I'll just say really quickly, on another optimistic note, I didn't really get into the child. The child was 3 or 4 years old when she returned to Canada, is doing amazingly well. And I think this is actually a testament to the mother and her resilience and her fortitude and her ability to protect her child in these camps. But what we're hearing is that she's emerged as a little leader in her preschool and organizes other children and activities and is having a lot of fun and seems really happy. And how remarkable is that resilience that we find in children, and I guess young children. I think there's a different set of considerations when we're talking about older children who really have imprinted those traumatic experiences in a way that it's going to be more difficult to overcome. But thank you.
John, thanks so much. It's really interesting to hear, kind of dive into a particular case. And I think as we've found across the entire year of this project, that there's so many principles of trauma-informed care that are relevant even with this unique population, and also think through some of the nuanced areas of service provision. So that kind of concludes the formal presentation part of our panel today. And so now what we're interested is to hear from you. You know, what is your reaction to what we've presented today? What questions do you have? We have a few for you if you don't have any burning questions, but I'd first like to open it up to the audience. Great, yes, please. Oh, good. Here.
Yeah, a comment and a question. I've been to these camps like twice now, and one of the comments I hear from the women often is, "I'm afraid. I don't think the community will accept me then." Mm-hmm. Right? So I'm curious whether you noticed that as well, and if so, if the reintegration, if there's any programming or any kind of thought that goes into readying the community for their arrival, just ready.
Yeah, I think those are great points. It's essential that the community be prepared. There's great potential for bullying of kids in schools, for excluding or stigmatizing families. Sometimes the media jumps on board that. Chris from USIP, in your work, you have really emphasized the importance of working with communities. On the other hand, there are countries that are returning them anonymously. So kids will go into a school and nobody will know that where that kid came from. Maybe they just lived abroad somewhere for a year, or they moved from another city. It becomes hard, which introduces another challenge, because as those kids grow older, they stop not believing the lies that their mothers have told them, and they might start asking more difficult questions. So I'm not sure how sustainable that is. Heidi, do you want to say anything more about
I
this
just
issue?
completely agree that there needs to be thought at the community level as well. And I think that can happen, across the different domains in different ways. But that's multi-level thinking around how to support families and kids.
I think that did really come through in the literature we reviewed. There's a lot of different community level activities that are either recommended or that programs are utilizing, particularly like organizing a series of community level conversations with different key leaders so that communities have a chance to ask difficult questions if they're anticipating receiving new numbers of women and children coming back. The other piece that kind of fits into a community level focus is capacity building for a range of providers and stakeholders so that people are really prepared with the skills, knowledge, competencies that they need to appropriately work with women and children. So, yeah, very important. And then thinking about how do we assess that as well, right?
Yeah, I think one issue as well that you're going to run into is that there can be a lot of stigma within the community itself, and it's just quite different, from how we think about settlement in relation to, say, refugees and newcomers. Because I've also, like Heidi and Steve, you have previously worked in this area, and you talk about good practices in that area. And of course, you want community welcoming. You want settlement to be centered within agencies that have competency and community intelligence. But what we're finding with these individuals who come back is there's actually a desire to separate themselves in many instances because of the potential stigma that exists within the community, and in some cases, a sense of anger at, well, the community kind of drove my child in this direction. It's more complex here, and it's going to be case dependent, I think, in terms of who is going to want to get in a fulsome way reintegrated into a community and a place of worship and a community center and different programs, and who's going to want to separate themselves and start a new life.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation. We're preparing for similar situations, but John, I have a question around child welfare, child protection services. Sounds like the situation with a lot of support, but did you guys take a lead on that to integrating or calling child welfare services for assessment, or how did all that work?
So there was no involvement, interestingly. And yeah, because we've talked about this, debated about this in many cases, and I still remember the conversation that I had with, there's a practitioner in Canada, Cecile Rousseau, who's a psychiatrist. She's fantastic. And we were sort of debating the merits of keeping children with their mothers who have gone overseas. And, the point that she made, and I take it to heart, is that especially when you think about young children, the kind of nurturing that they need, even if the mother is radicalized. Separation of the child is unwise. So,
Totally agree with that theory.
yeah.
But like, was there any kind of external pressure saying, child welfare should be at the border when family arrives or anything like that?
I haven't seen it yet, Dave. It's really been their CMP as the primary point of contact. And of course, intelligence service is going to be there as well. Yeah.
The other question is that trauma can be money in terms of how it works and operates. What's the plan going forward in terms of how long will you be involved in the case? Is this something you'll check in over years or months? Or, I think this is uncharted territory, right, for us.
It is.
Any thoughts and conversations that are happening?
I mean, my gut feeling is to say that we'd approach it like we would other cases on an as-needed basis. And many of the service participants have been with us now for 3 years and have a lot of needs. And, we're seeing ups and downs. We're seeing progress. So, again, it's kind of an unsatisfying answer. I think it's going to be case dependent, but I think we're going to find a lot of complex, lasting trauma in these cases. When you think about, exposure to violence, indoctrination, and then, how many years have they been in this camp for? 40 years? In that environment? Can you imagine?
Especially when infants are being born into war zones. It sounds like voluntary resilience is a big supported.
Yeah. And we know we're not going to see that in other cases as well. So each one is going to pose unique challenges.
Thanks so much for your question.
Thanks,
Yes,
Dave.
please, in the back.
I'm a senior program that also works with youth with land population, and the question that I had, and it's kind of coming out in our jurisdiction, which is is clients that would be returning to our jurisdiction, whether because that's their trauma, that's when they choose to be returning, but have not yet returned, trying to work with them. Obviously, there's a host of legal and political challenges to that, but how can we better start to have cohesive strategies for doing that? I know, John, you mentioned working with families in the meantime, and maybe you have mentioned capacity building, but in a concerted way, how do we address those who we know may be coming back to our jurisdictions but are still remaining in the camp?
You wanna-
So your question is one of what's the preparatory work that can be done during this waiting period?
And how do we get better at it? Because right
Yeah.
now, as I said, with the legal and the political challenges, it is difficult for many reasons, but how do we overcome that? In order to do preparatory work, we can make contact.
Heidi? Steve?
This is turning into a very Canadian conversation. I mean, optimally, oh God, this is very Canadian. Global Affairs Canada, the ministry would be facilitating access to the camps, right, MR? I mean, we'd be able to go in, do a needs assessment, find out exactly what's going on, get some indication of risk, and then, that is going to set the stage for our initial approach to resettlement. And I know, this isn't just in our interest. It's not just what we're advocating for. This is what the Mounties are advocating for as well, right? So we're doing a disservice. This is the thing. All the countries that are leaving people there, and I know the level of anger that exists, and it's justified in many cases, right? But leaving people there in perpetuity, especially children, is setting the stage for challenges that they shouldn't be at the level they're going to be at if we just ripped the Band-Aid off and brought them home.
I just want to say one comment is that we were put on alert of families coming back. We did what we got to engage with family, we got the room set up, and then we were told we don't know what's happening.
Yeah,
It caused tension between us and the family.
yeah.
We were sort of we were trying to build trust, right? And then they were asking for something about it, and they said, well, it's up to the global affairs.
Yeah, we can't force repatriation.
Twice, actually. So
Yeah.
now I'm put on alert third time. And we're not going to react. We're just going to do nothing. Because it's sort of like we need conversations. So I think at the government level, yes, they're coming, no, they're not coming. If they're coming, they're coming.
Well, and maybe the experience of Kazakhstan and other countries that have done this, Steve, is instructive because they've done it much differently, haven't they?
Just noticing few minutes left here. I want to be sure we get our last question. Oh, you, Ans.
I was thinking whether I should ask you this or not, whether my question is relevant, but as soon as hopefully the world is moving to recognize Russia as a state terrorist, so maybe this question is relevant. Do you have any problems for women and children coming from Ukraine and the refugees? A lot of them lost Tell about them. So
You could answer that.
Pardon me? Yeah, a great question. I think that the situation, at least in the U.S., is somewhat distinct for Ukrainians who are arriving because they're not arriving through the typical refugee channels, which would, connect them with a set of services, resettlement services, and then potentially connection to social services and even mental health services. And we've not received nearly as many Ukrainians in the U.S. as many countries in Europe. So I can't speak to any particular programs for Ukrainian women and children arriving, but maybe Heidi or Steve?
I'm not sure of specific programs, but as we've been building this 5R model, we've been reflecting on the fact that, with adaptations, this may be helpful to other populations, including refugees or people with experiencing forced displacement. Rehabilitation would not be as relevant, but thinking about how do you build in that attention to the initial needs, the resettlement needs, and then the resilience, so that there's more of an arc in the longer term, because many services are short-lived for refugees, at least in the United States. There's sort of a 4 to 8 month window when services are in place, and then there's less after that. So I think there's needed thinking around how this can apply to other populations, including those from the Ukraine.
Just to pick up two last thoughts before we wrap up. If anyone's interested in using the measure, it can be done. It's not monetized. We just want people to collaborate and work with us so that it's coordinated in some way. And then also, I think it's an open question how long these programs have to exist. What we're finding in some contexts, like in Central Asia, is that the initial reintegration, getting into schools and communities has gone very well and successfully, but points of difficulty then emerge around kids becoming adolescents, and also in those cases when people are being released from prison down the line. And so there's a whole special set of needs that emerges then. And then I think we also have to keep in mind that about 1/4 to 1/5 of those kids were not in regular classrooms the way that they should have been for a variety of reasons, maybe learning difficulties or whatnot. And so what's going to happen to those kids when they get older? I think that's a concern as well.
Yeah, thank you. Want to thank each of the panelists today. Thank you for the opportunity to summarize this work we've been engaged in for the last year, and so appreciate your questions and engagement today, and appreciate our conference organizers as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks.